Anatomy people, how are you doing today? We are moving forward for our next lecture topic, which is the joints, the connections between bones. Now, oftentimes we'll use the word articulations instead of joints, but it's the same idea. It's where a bone is connected to another bone. This is going to create stability in our skeletal system while still allowing for movement and mobility. So, we're going to start by classifying joints in three ways, three different structural types of joints. And those three types are fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Now, all three of these are basically describing what's in between the two bones. So, if you have fibers, collagen fibers linking the two bones directly together, that's a fibrous joint. You will see that in your sutures, like this squamous suture in the skull right here. If you have a pad of cartilage between the two joints, like we see here in between our lumbar vertebrae, that would be a cartilaginous joint. And if you have this fluid called synovial fluid in between the two bones in a joint, then that would be a synovial joint. Now, right off the top of your head, what do you think is the most mobile of these three? Fibers joining the bones, cartilage in between the bones, or fluid between the bones? If you said fluid between the bones, good job. You are correct. Okay, so these are our three structural classifications. There are also three functional classifications. And the simple way we do it is we say joints can either be very movable, kind of movable, or not at all movable. Notice I forgot the word all right there. So let's stick that in there. Boom. Okay, so there are fancier science words for these, but I just chose definitely, kind of, and not at all movable. Sutures, where would they fall? Sutures would be not at all movable. What about the elbow joint here? We got the radius and the ulna joint the humerus and the ulna joint here. That's definitely movable. Then the intervertebral joint would be kind of movable. So let's now kind of put these two classifications together and look at some examples. Starting with immovable fibrous joints. Sutures are immovable fibrous joints. So in this picture right here, what sutures do I see? Got a lovely suture up here. Which one is that? It is the sagittal suture. Down here, what suture do we have? We've met this one as well. It is the lambdoidal suture. Now we know sutures had this characteristic where there's like this interdigitation of the bones to give you a better connection. And then spanning the two bones, there are going to be collagen fibers linking the two bones together really, really strongly. And this is going to be immobile. Immobile, fibrous. This makes these joints really, really strong, and it totally limits their mobility. There is no mobility here. And we're sacrificing mobility for strength. And think about it. This is the cranium we're looking at here. What's the cranium protecting? It's protecting the brain, which I think you'll agree is pretty important. All right. If we look at the side here, we see another suture that we named in lab. What suture is this one right here? That guy is, of course, the squamous suture, which I'll abbreviate right there. Now, those are the named sutures. Oh, yeah. What's that one right there? Remember that one? The coronal suture. Those are sutures we named in lab, but there are obviously other sutures as well. And all these other sutures are also immovable fibrous joints. Okay. Did you always have sutures in your skull? No, you did not. When you were a little baby, little babies don't have fully formed sutures. Instead, they have a membrane in between these bones. Okay? membrane in between these sutures we named earlier. And these areas are called fontanelles. You're probably familiar with them. Maybe you've seen or touched the soft spot on a baby's head. And there are different fontanelles, and they actually end up closing at different ages. But what's the whole point here? Why do we not want sutures too early? If we form sutures too early, what would that restrict? It would restrict the growth of the brain. Absolutely. Okay. So now we just did an immovable fibrous joint. Let's do an immovable cartilaginous joint. And the example is the first sternocostal joints between the sternum and the costal cartilage of the first rib right there. These are called synchondroses. One would be a synchondrosis. We've seen chondro before, haven't we? Seen that word part, chondro? We saw chondrocytes, right? So chondro means cartilage, and then syn means together. So we're synchondrosis, together with cartilage. So those are some immovable cartilaginous joints. Then there's also slightly movable joints, and we've got some slightly movable fibrous joints. We're going to have two examples, one in our leg, one in our forearm. Looking at the leg one first, we got this distal tibiofibular joint right here. We see the fibers. The fibers are in this ligament called the interosseous ligament. Interosseous meaning between bones. And you have a little bit of movement here. Not a lot, but you have a little bit of movement here. And there are fibers anchoring the two bones. If you've ever had like a high ankle sprain, you might have hurt this ligament right here. All right. If we look at the forearm, so here's our forearm. We have this joint between the radius and the ulna, this disto-radial-ulnar joint here. And again, we see an interosseous ligament linking the bones together. And you are going to use this when you go from palms up to palms down. When you do that particular motion, which I am doing right now, and you can't see me doing that. So palm up, palm down, you're getting a little bit of movement at this distal radial ulnar joint. Okay. There are also slightly movable cartilaginous joints. And they are going to have fibrocartilage as the cartilage between the bones. And we see them at this joint between these two lumbar vertebrae here, between the two bodies of the lumbar vertebrae. That is a symphysis. It's called a vertebral symphysis. There's also one called the pubic symphysis, which is the anterior joint between these two pubic bones here. So pubic bone, pubic bone. And these joints are strong because they have this fibrocartilage between them. Fibrocartilage is like hyaline cartilage, just with extra collagen. We see some down here. We see the pinkness of the collagen. We see some chondroblasts in there as well. Fantastic. Chondrocytes. Did I say chondroblast or chondrocyte? I meant chondrocyte. It's the last mistake I'm going to make on this video. Haha, we'll see. Okay, these are slightly movable joints. I mean, you don't have a great deal of movement between the bodies of your vertebrae, but you have some. You don't have a great deal of movement between your pubic symphysis, but you have some. Especially in pregnancy, you get some movement there, which is good. All right. So, guys, we're done with the cartilaginous and the fibrous joints. We looked at slightly movable and immovable varieties of each. We are now moving onward to our synovial joints. Synovial joints are freely movable. Your shoulder joint, your hip joint, freely movable joints. And there are some basic things we're going to see. we're going to see, and we're going to go through all these. I'm going to name them now. Articular cartilage, a joint cavity, an articular capsule, synovial fluid, ligaments, blood vessels, and nerves. Now we have an example of a synovial joint over here. This looks like an interphalangeal joint. So between your phalanges and your fingers, perhaps. Can you tell me if this is a grown-up or a child, please? That is your bonus question. Tell me if this is a picture of a child or an adult, and you have to tell me why. You can't just say, it's a kid or it's a grown-up person. You got to tell me the why. Okay? All right. So, at our joint surfaces, so on our epiphyses, so here's an epiphysis, here's an epiphysis, and on the joint surfaces, we have this articular cartilage, which we see in there. It's hyaline cartilage, which we have over here. Beautiful, gorgeous hyaline cartilage, chondrocytes and lacunae. We know hyaline cartilage is more watery, more flexible, more cushion-y than bone. So it makes sense to have this type of cartilage on your joint surfaces so you can better absorb the shocks that we associate with movements. All right. Now I want you to notice there's some space between the two bones here. Check that out. That space is called the joint cavity. So the joint cavity is the space in here. The walls of the joint cavity are created by this layer called the articular capsule, which we'll talk about next. And then inside this space, we're going to have fluid called synovial fluid. We'll talk about that soon as well. I bet you can already figure out why we want fluid in these movable joints. All right. So the articular capsule, we see it down here. We see it down here. And it's got two parts. It has a dense, irregular connective tissue part called the fibrous capsule, which is going to be continuous with the periosteum of each bone. Then we have an inner part called the synovial membrane, which, as you can probably guess, is going to make the synovial fluid. All right. Speaking of synovial fluid, the green guy here is our synovial membrane, and it makes synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is made from blood. You will have blood vessels in this joint capsule, in that synovial membrane, to make synovial fluid. You're always making some synovial fluid, taking back some old synovial fluid. And the point of making it is threefold. It is going to be for lubrication, so things can move nicer. So it's kind of like oil in that regard. It's also kind of like suspension fluid in that it absorbs shock. And last but not least, it helps move nutrients, waste, etc. around. Now, what or when do you make more of it? You make more of it with activity. This is why warming up before you exercise is a good thing. Now, by warming up, I don't mean stretching. I mean moving. I mean, stretching's fine too, but moving, doing some movements through that joint. So you're not going to go out to the track for your track workout and just run your fast intervals immediately. You're going to jog slowly for a bit. Maybe do a slow mile jog first. Maybe do some, easy light movements, some skipping, some bounding, that sort of stuff. And warming up is going to get you to make more synovial fluid. It also gets it waterier. It's not a good English word, but you know what I mean. And if it's more watery, if it's less viscous, it flows better. So definitely warm up. All right. Let's keep going. Let's talk ligaments for a minute here. Yeah, ligaments. So ligaments, we've met them already. Ligaments are made of dense regular connective tissue. We see that over here. Look at the waviness of the collagen fibers here. Ligaments are really strong, especially in that direction. So not as strong like in a transverse direction, but in that direction of the collagen fibers, ligaments are darn strong. Now, we need ligaments for reinforcement. We need reinforcement because synovial joints are freely movable. And with movability, we lose strength. We're looking at the knee right here. And in the knee, there are a pair of ligaments that crisscross. We're actually doing these in lab too, so I thought I'd point them out. There are two ligaments here that crisscross within the knee. There's the posterior cruciate ligament and the anterior cruciate ligament. The word cruciate means they're going to form an X, they're going to cross one another. And these guys basically prevent the femur and the tibia from sliding back and forth. So they're great examples of reinforcing ligaments. If we look at the side of the knee, we have ligaments running from the femur down to the bones below, like the tibial collateral ligament on the inside and the fibular collateral ligament on the outside. And we're hitting those in lab, which is why I wanted to point them out as examples. All right, we have a lot of blood vessels in our joints to feed those joint structures. I mean, we talked about it. If you are making synovial fluid, you need a good blood supply to do that. Good joint health requires good blood supply. There are also a lot of nerves to our joints, a lot of innervation. This is important. Innervation of your joints is important. I don't know why I decided to write innervation. It's taken me a long time to write it. There we go. Innervation is important because you need to know what your joints are doing. There is actually this sense you have. It is this sense of body position, limb and joint awareness. It's called proprioception. Proprio kind of means like your belongings, what you own. It's like your sense of your body self. So it is important for what? For balance, for movement. You can't balance. And you're always balancing, even when you're not like doing a yoga pose like this dude here. You're always balancing. When you're walking, when you're standing, when you're sitting, you are balancing. And balancing requires your brain knows what your joints and limbs are doing. So we need nerves in our joints to let our brain know what they're doing. Your brain always tells your joints to do something. Tells your muscles to make a movement, right? Then you make that movement, and the nerves in your joints give you feedback to let you adjust and correct. Proprioception is something you can get better at. If you're a gymnast or a diver, you probably have really good proprioception. Yeah. Let's keep going. Let's not dilly-dally today. There are associated joint structures that we need to mention called bursae. These are basically bags of synovial fluid. So a bursa is a bag of synovial fluid. It's like a synovial membrane with synovial fluid in it stuck between things. So for example, between tendons, between a bone and a ligament, we could have bursae. And bursae are going to be in places where things could rub against one another. We don't want undue, unnecessary friction. Bursae help us remove that. The word bursae means like bag, like money bag, kind of related to the word bursar or purse. All right. Actually, is it related to the word purse? I don't know if it is or not. So, forget I said that. I'll edit that out later. Sometimes the bursae are really long and stretched out. And we see that in our foot right here. And a long stretched out bursae might be wrapped around a tendon. And that is called a tendon sheath. A tendon sheath. Okay. Good stuff. Let's do a few more things. All right, we got the characteristics of synovial joints. We also will classify them based on how many planes they're able to move in. Okay, so do me a favor. If you stand up in anatomical position, if you're able to do that right now, get in anatomical position like this lady here, and then bend your elbow, right? So stay in anatomical position, bend your elbow. Your elbow can only go in that one plane, that one direction. Your elbow is moving in a sagittal plane there, okay, as it goes up and down. So your elbow joint would be uniaxial. All right, now take your palm and bend your fingers like you're beckoning someone. Bend your fingers like you're beckoning someone. And then spread your fingers out. So you can spread your fingers out, but you can also say, hey, come here with your fingers. So there's two movements right there. So that would be, the joints there would be biaxial. So these joints right here, your knuckle joints, are biaxial because they move in two planes. So both sagittal and frontal. Your elbow joint is only moving in the sagittal plane, so it is uniaxial. Your hip and your shoulder joint, your hip joint and your shoulder joint, those are tri or multiaxial because you can move those in all three planes. Okay, good stuff. Now let's talk about the structural types of synovial joints. And there are 6 types. Okay? 6 types. I'm trying to think if I can have a mnemonic device for this. I don't know. Got CHP. I don't know. Maybe you can think of a good mnemonic device for these and send it to me in an email. There are plane joints, hinge joints, pivot joints, condyloid joints, saddle joints, and ball and socket joints. All right, let's talk about them. Plane joints first. Plane joints are found where the joint surfaces of the bones are relatively flat. That's what the word plane means in this case. The joint surfaces are relatively flat. That allows for a nice, easy gliding motion like you would get between these carpal bones. These carpal bones here. So great example of plane joints right there. Next up we have hinge joints. Hinge joint is like a hot dog and a bun. And it allows for just that uniaxial motion like you have your elbow joint. And that's what we see here, the elbow joint. The joint between the trochlea of the humerus and the trochlear notch of the ulna is a classic example of a hinge joint because it looks like a hinge. Next up, we have what are called pivot joints. And that is where we have a projection of a bone with either a bony ring or a bony plus ligament ring around it. This is the joint between your atlas and your axis. Remember your C1 and C2. It's called your atlantoaxial joint. And it lets you think about it. It lets you rotate your head. You're saying, no, this stuff is not too hard. No, this is not too much. You're using a pivot joint as you do that. All right, that's 3 done. Let's do another one. Condyloid joints, like your knuckle joints. So this joint right here is a knuckle joint. We can't just call this a knuckle joint. We would call it a metacarpophalangeal joint. That might be the longest word of the semester right there. A metacarpophalangeal joint, which isn't that bad. It's a long word, but it's between the metacarpal and that proximal phalanx. A condyloid joint is kind of like a mini ball and socket. Like it's not quite a ball and not quite a socket, but it's almost there. And these condyloid joints here, these metacarpophalangeal ones, remember they were the biaxial ones, the ones where you could move in 2 planes. Okay, we are almost done. We have 2 more joint types to do. So let's do another one. saddle joints. Saddle joints are where you have two saddle-like structures hitting one another. And the only saddle joint we are worrying about is this one right here between the trapezium and the first metacarpal bone. So this would be our first carpo-metacarpal joint. There we go. That trapezium bone meets that first metacarpal bone to make a saddle joint, two saddle-shaped structures against one another. It allows for thumb movements. Remember, you can have opposition of your thumbs, where you can touch your thumb to your fingers very easily. All right, one more joint type, then we'll talk about some movements. Last but not least is the ball and socket. It's kind of self-explanatory. You have a rounded head, you have an indentation, ball and socket. Elbow, shoulder joint. Not elbow. Why did I say elbow? I said I wouldn't make any more mistakes today, and I made one. My bad. But I gave you an extra credit assignment today, so it's all good. So the hip joint, the shoulder joint, there we go, are going to be ball and socket joints. A lot of mobility there. Not as much stability, but a lot of mobility. Okay. Last but not least for this video on joints, to finish out today, it is joint movements, synovial joint movements. And there are three basic types of movements: angular, gliding, and rotational. So we're going to go through all three of these guys and give you a lot of good examples. Starting with gliding joints. Gliding joints, like the name implies, have two bone surfaces that are going to slide against one another. Now they have to be flat, so a plane joint is perfect here. And remember, we saw those plane joints between the carpal bones in the wrist. Also between the facets in your vertebrae. Remember the superior and inferior articular facets in your vertebrae? If you looked at the lab on, what was that, lab number 11, if you've done that one, those superior and inferior articular facets, those joints are going to allow for gliding. Okay, angular movements. Like the name implies, angular movements are going to change the angle of a joint. And there are four types of angular movements we're going to do: flexion and extension, then abduction and adduction. Flexion and extension are going to happen generally in our sagittal plane, whereas abduction and adduction are going to happen in our frontal plane. There we go. Good stuff. So, flexion is when the joint angle gets smaller. So the great example of this is the knee. Bending your knee backwards from a standing position. So when you're originally standing, so like this, the lady on the right over here, look at her. So right here, her joint angle of her knee is about 180 degrees. But once she flexes that knee, the joint angle here, the angle here has decreased. That's flexion. If she brings her leg back forward, the joint angle is going to come closer back to that 180. That's extension. So flexion is a decrease, and extension is an increase of that joint angle. We also see it with the shoulder here. Shoulder is a bit weird. In our starting position, let's imagine the arm just keeps going. So that line there, the angle there is, 180 or so. Then as the arm moves upward like this angle here is getting smaller. So that's flexion. It's a little bit hard to see that without imagining that line, okay? So we got some examples of flexion and extension here. Remember, flexion is a decrease in the joint angle. Extension is an increase. Now we can also do it with our neck. So you bend your chin towards your chest, that's flexion. Take your head back up, that's extension. And if you keep going back to look up at your ceiling, that is hyperextension. So extension beyond the normal. We can do this with our back as well. Our trunk, we can flex forward, extend back, then hyperextend a little bit more. All right, so that's it for flexion, extension. I mean, I didn't give you every example. You could also flex and extend your fingers, your wrists, your elbow, right? But you get the idea, hopefully. There's now AB and adduction. So abduction and adduction. The duct part means to move or draw. So ab means away. So in abduction, you're moving an arm or a leg away from the midline of a body. When you move it back towards the body, that's going to be adduction. Think about it. If you add your arm and your leg to your torso, you're going to do adduction. If you're abducting them, you're taking them away, right? Perfect. So we can abduct and adduct, and notice these motions are in the frontal plane. Okay. We are getting close to being done. We just have to do a few more. Rotational movements. This is where we move about an axis. Axis. There we go. Think about rotating your head to say no. You can also rotate your arm and leg. Like the way she's spinning her foot out and then back forward. Do the same thing with your hand. It's easy to see if you bend your elbow and you do this, what this guy is doing here. So bend your elbow, put your palm on your opposite abdomen, and then you can take your palm out and back and forth. Hopefully you're doing this right now. I strongly encourage you, when you're studying these motions, just to make sure you know them, is to actually do the motions. That is such a great way to embed it in your brain. Okay, last but not least, a couple special hand forearm motions. When your palm is forward, it is supinated. So the act of rotating your palm forward is supination. The act of rotating your palm backwards is pronation. You can also think about this as your hands being up or down, right? So if you're holding the bowl of soup, you must have supinated your hands. If you want to hold a delicious bowl of soup in your palms like this, you are going to supinate your hands. And the guy who is serving the soup here has pronated his hand. When you're supinated, up top here, your radius and your ulnar are parallel. When you're pronated, your radius crosses over your ulna. You're spinning the radius on that little bony capitulum. And I think we are all finished for joints. We did this whole lecture. It was not a bad one, a little more than half an hour. Hope it was as much fun for you as it was for me. Don't know if it ever could be. We're done. I'll see you guys next time. Next time we're talking nervous system. So take care. Bye-bye.